I made a video earlier about one of the most despicable human beings, Coulter, and her genocidal tweet that got almost 11 million views on Twitter, in which, in response to a video clip of a speech of Navajo activist and artist Melanie Yazzie, Coulter said, "We didn't kill enough Indians." I shit you not. She said that, and not only did she say it, but Twitter didn't take it down. They said its reach was going to be limited because it might violate their hate speech policy or their policy against violence, but they still showed it to almost 11 million people. So I made a video about that. I did not expect it to go quite so viral. It's been up for like 6 hours on my YouTube channel and has hit 100,000 views and has, something like 2,000 comments. And I honestly, I cannot moderate comments on my YouTube channel. I get more than 10,000 a day. But I do try to scroll through and respond to some of them. And there were several comments on that video that I feel compelled to make a video response to because they were spreading misinformation about Indigenous voters in this country. Right after the 2024 election, we saw a very poorly constructed, self-reported exit poll that tried to identify demographics and how they voted in the presidential election. And that initially reported something like 60% of Indigenous voters voted for Donald Trump. And right after that video came out, a number of large creators were shitting on Native voters. And I was like, y'all, did you look at the poll? First of all, it's a very small sample size. Second of all, people are self-reporting their ethnicity. Third of all, it was in a limited number of precincts. And none of the polling was conducted in locations with large populations of Native Americans. Now, let's not forget that Native Americans only make up about 3% of the United States population due to a centuries-long ongoing genocide conducted, enacted, continued by the United States government. So to see creators who were angry about the results of the election immediately start to blame this tiny and highly oppressed minority of folks who are known to experience some of the worst voter suppression, also the worst violence committed against them, right? Like missing and murdered Indigenous women. Indigenous women and girls face tenfold the increase of violent crime than your average American. We knew that there were problems getting ballots to the Navajo reservation. There were large quantities of ballots that were delivered in Spanish only. Newsflash, not everybody who's not white speaks Spanish. They were not delivered in Dene and they were not delivered in English. And again, incredible active voter suppression among Indigenous populations, especially folks on reservations in this country. To blame such an oppressed tiny group for the results of the election when the largest group of folks who voted for Donald Trump were white Gen X men, white Gen X men made the difference in the election. This is me looking at some of my friends' husbands. I know how y'all voted. You contributed to the hell that we're all living. Now I realize you're very insulated from it and you're not really experiencing very many setbacks. In fact, you're probably prospering more than ever at this moment in time. Fuck you. Okay, sorry, I got a little worked up. To blame Indigenous Americans based on that one small exit polling was incredibly flawed and I think showed a lot of the anti-Indigenous bias that exists in this country to this day, even amongst folks on the left, because I saw a lot of folks on the left perpetuating this myth that fuck Natives, they all voted for Donald Trump. It's interesting, and by that I mean horrifying, that still in July 2025, people believe that misinformation about Indigenous voters in the last election and somehow still blame them online, including a lot of people in my comments of that video about Coulter, who regardless of the actual voter data, I don't understand how somebody who could claim to be progressive could say in my comments, Coulter is allowed to say we should have killed more Indians because the person writing that comment wrongly believed that 60% of Native people voted for Donald Trump. So you think that Native people deserve to have a genocide against them escalated because you think that more than half of them voted for Donald. That is not a progressive position to justify genocide or to excuse somebody's genocidal comments against one of the most oppressed minority groups or against any group of people because you have some perception of how they voted in the last election. There's nothing progressive about supporting or excusing genocide. Honestly, I know some of the folks who left those comments are subscribers of my channel. Shame on you. Do better than that. But let's go ahead and look at what the actual data shows. Let's go ahead and look at some more accurate information about how Natives voted in the 2024 presidential election, rather than continuing to perpetuate misinformation because you saw a poorly constructed small poll that came out right after the election when your emotions were all amped up and you were real pissed and you're like, who can I blame? Oh, I'll blame Indigenous people. I'll blame a tiny, highly oppressed minority group because of this poorly constructed poll where I didn't bother to read the details of who was polled, the way that the polling was conducted, any of the methodology behind it, nothing. Again, do better than that, y'all. Please do better. So if we look at the Brookings Institute, who actually had a report out in December of last year, they found that just as in previous elections, Indigenous Americans vote Democratic more often than not. The Brookings Institute found that 57% of Native American voters voted for Kamala Harris and 39% voted for Donald Trump. And consistently across elections, what they found in the presidential election of 2024 was similar to what they found in previous elections, that when you ask Native voters where their priorities are, what they are thinking about when they cast their vote, they choose tribal sovereignty, land rights, and cultural preservation as their key issues. And as with other ethnic groups, if you want to look at who amongst the Native population did vote for Trump, I'll give you two guesses. 47% voted for Donald Trump. When we look at who we want to think about is responsible for the reality that we're living now, who did I yell at earlier in this video? It's men, especially Gen X men who have contributed, who voted for, who supported Trump. If you break it down by age group, every age bracket voted a majority for Kamala Harris amongst Indigenous voters. If you break it down by gender, actually, both men and women voted a majority for Kamala Harris. It's just that women really overwhelmingly voted for her. But you still actually had a majority of Native men who voted for Kamala over Donald Trump, unlike some of the other demographics when you look at how men voted. And let's dig a little bit deeper and look at the trend between the 2022 and 2024 elections. You actually saw more folks last November, more Indigenous folks last November voted for Democratic candidates than they did in the 2022 midterms. Now, it's important to understand when you're looking at what sways Native voters that economic concerns are of high import to them. That tends to be one of the top issues because Indigenous Americans, especially on tribal land, face really difficult economic circumstances and are systemically economically disadvantaged. However, the rest of American society is impacted by economic downturns. Native Americans are impacted more. But it's also interesting to note that Native voters are more concerned about environmental issues than your average voter. But still, the highest concern for Native voters is tribal sovereignty and land rights, which makes sense because we have stolen so much of their land from them. And tribal sovereignty in the United States is still limited sovereignty in many ways. But let's jump back for a second, right? Like, we know Republicans don't give a shit about climate change. We know Republicans don't care about environmental impacts. But when you look at Indigenous families, 89% support providing more resources to protect families against the impacts of climate change and to prepare for a climate change future. Native voters also overwhelmingly, 88%, support expanding clean energy, clean manufacturing jobs, and they want to see government funds invested in clean energy in order to lower electric bills and energy costs. Now, something important to note here, Democrats pay attention. The Harris-Walz campaign invested heavily in outreach toward Indigenous populations, $370 million. The Trump campaign did very little, although Markwayne Mullin, who is a senator from Oklahoma and a member of the Cherokee Nation, and y'all, he's a real piece of work. He pushed actively for federal recognition of the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina, and he made a number of other token claims to try to get Natives to vote for Trump. But despite those efforts, Native voters overwhelmingly did vote for Kamala Harris. So I just want to caution you here, please stop scapegoating Indigenous voters and trying to make them responsible for what white people have done in this country. And also, please read the details of a poll, y'all. Please understand that just because you see a statistic lobbed at you, that doesn't mean that it means exactly what the headlines claim. We can hold ourselves to a higher standard than what I saw in my comments today.